The high-security courtroom in April 2026 felt like a pressurized chamber. The air was heavy with the scent of sterile floor wax and the low-frequency static charge of dozens of professional cameras streaming the proceedings to a global audience. This was the trial of the century, a moment of profound reckoning for one of the most powerful figures in the modern medical world. Emil Koenig sat on the witness stand, his slight frame appearing vulnerable against the towering, dark wood architecture of justice. His hands trembled as he adjusted the microphone, a physical manifestation of the war being waged inside his mind. He was here to dismantle his father's legacy, but in doing so, he knew he was also discarding the only family he had ever truly known. Directly across from him sat Dr. Gerhard Koenig, even under the weight of such grave accusations. The elder Koenig remained an imposing and composed figure. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, and his tailored suit did not have a single wrinkle. His eyes, sharp and predatory, never left his son's face. It was a cold, intimidating stare, designed to remind Emil of the decades of psychological grooming he had endured. Gerhard wasn't just a father, he was a monument to human achievement. And he looked at Emil with a mixture of icy disappointment and clinical curiosity, as if he were observing a failed cell culture under a microscope rather than a human being of his own creation. Emil's testimony began with a long, shaky breath that echoed through the silent room. He started by describing the sanctuary, his father's private off-grid research facility nestled deep in the mountains. To the public, it was marketed as a mythical retreat for the world's greatest minds. But to Emil, it was a fortress of secrets and shadows. He spoke of the absolute isolation. His motivation for being here was a complex, painful tapestry of guilt and a desperate, lingering need for the truth. For years he had chased his father's approval, molding himself into the perfect air just to catch a single glimpse of warmth in those frozen eyes. But that childhood desire had been burned away by the horrors he had eventually discovered within those walls. He recounted the night in 2025 when the facade of his father's greatness finally crumbled. Emil had gained unauthorized access to a series of heavily encrypted files hidden within the facility's mainframe. He expected to find revolutionary data on gene editing or longevity. Instead, he found a digital graveyard. The logs detailed a long history of unauthorized human trials that spanned 5 long years, from 2020 to 2025. These were the Koenig protocols. The files contained videos, heart rates, and the final breaths of those involved. The medical miracles that Gerhard performed, the curing of incurable diseases, were not the result of genius alone. They were built on the broken bodies and silent screams of the vulnerable, people who had been lured to the sanctuary with promises of hope, only to become disposable biological units in a legacy of blood. The emotional conflict within Emil was a jagged blade cutting through his resolve. He spoke of the realization that his father was a monster, disguised as a savior of humanity. The very science that had brought him global fame was a collection of hidden crimes. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The courtroom was silent as Emil reached the most painful part of his testimony. He looked directly at his father and mentioned a specific name that caused the entire room to gasp: Elena. He didn't describe her as a patient or a data point. He described her as his younger sister, the girl who had disappeared into a prestigious overseas school years ago. Emil's voice became a sharp whip as he revealed the truth, that Elena hadn't been sent away. She had been the first and most tragic subject of their father's darkest scientific ambitions. The revelation of Elena's true fate sent a shockwave through the gallery. But the defense was prepared to strike back. Led by an attorney known for ruthless efficiency, they began a calculated campaign to dismantle Emil's credibility. They presented records of his past struggles, highlighting periods of depression and a brief history with prescription medication. They framed him not as a whistleblower, but as a disgruntled, drug-addicted son seeking a bitter, public revenge. The attorney paced before the jury, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy, as she suggested that Emil's descriptions of the sanctuary were the product of a fractured mind rather than a factual reality. Gerhardt watched this with a slight nod, his silver hair catching the courtroom lights, while a mask of paternal sorrow hid the predator beneath. Emil did not break. He waited for the onslaught to subside, his gaze fixed on a small, heavy object, the black box. And this was a rugged hard drive he had salvaged from the wreckage of his father's digital empire. When his legal team finally regained the floor, they played the contents for the entire world to see. The courtroom lights dimmed, and the monitors flickered to life, displaying grainy, time-stamped video logs from the final days of the sanctuary experiments. The silence that followed was absolute. On the screen, Elena appeared, not as the vibrant girl the world remembered, but as a ghost of herself, hooked to a complex web of biomonitors. The footage was a visceral, haunting portrait of betrayal. In one sequence, Elena's vitals plummeted, the heart monitor a rhythmic, desperate cry for help. Instead of rushing to her side, Gerhardt remained at his console, his back turned to his daughter's suffering. He was narrating into a recorder, his voice steady as a surgeon's hand, discussing the efficiency of the viral vector they had introduced into her system. He spoke of her pain as a significant data point, and her failing organs as acceptable variables. To him, Elena was no longer a child. She was a biological puzzle he was determined to solve. The cruelty was not found in his anger, but in his utter clinical indifference to her humanity. As the videos played, Emil recounted the psychological grooming that had kept him silent for years. He described a childhood where emotions were treated as weaknesses, and where his father's love was a reward, granted only for absolute obedience and intellectual perfection. Gerhardt had taught him that the advancement of science required a godlike perspective that stood above individual morality, whereas Emil had been raised to be the second in command of this cold new world, taught to look at suffering and see only a problem to be calculated. The guilt radiated from Emil in waves. He had watched the shadows grow at the sanctuary and, for a long time, had done nothing, paralyzed by the fear of losing the only man he had ever looked up to. The momentum of the trial shifted when a surprise witness entered the room, a former researcher from the facility who had fled months prior. This witness corroborated every detail of Emil's testimony, describing secret burials and the falsified reports that had allowed Gerhardt to maintain his status as a medical pioneer. The facade of invincibility that Gerhardt had maintained finally began to crack, and the heavy air in the room became stifling. His legal team looked panicked, feared their strategies crumbling under the weight of physical evidence and direct testimony. Internal conflict tore at Emil as he sat there, watching his father's empire dissolve. He felt a sickening resonance with the man across from him, a fear that, by being so clinical in his destruction of his father, he was proving he was exactly the cold, detached person Gerhardt had raised him to be. Was this justice? Or was it just another exercise in the Koenig family's brand of ruthless efficiency? Just as the defense seemed defeated and the judge prepared to recess, Gerhardt stood up, knocking his chair back with a heavy thud. His composure was shattered. His face was flushed with fury as he pointed at his son. "I did it to save you, Emil," he roared, his voice echoing through the stunned courtroom. "Everything I did, every choice I made, echo was for you." The echo of Dr. Gerhard Koenig's roar lingered in the high-security courtroom like a toxic residue, freezing the breath of every journalist and legal expert in attendance. Emil did not respond with a shout or a display of shock. Instead, he moved with a deliberate, agonizing slowness, reaching into his worn briefcase to produce the final, definitive piece of evidence. These were not digital logs from the sanctuary servers, but a physical folder of his own personal medical records, spanning his entire life. The room leaned in as he began to read from the documents, his voice now a steady, unbreakable instrument of truth. He revealed that the unexplained childhood illnesses he had suffered were not natural ailments, but carefully managed side effects of his father's early experiments. He was the primary, yet unwitting subject of the very first Koenig protocols. As he flipped through the pages, displaying charts of synthetic antibodies and unauthorized gene splicing sequences, the horrifying reality dawned on the gallery. Gerhardt had not just used strangers. He had used his own son as the foundation for his biological revolution. Elena had been the refinement of the process, the tragic attempt to perfect what had begun with Emil. His health, his cognitive sharpness, and his physical resilience were direct results of his father's clandestine crimes. The moral dilemma was a physical weight in the air. Emil was a living monument to the very atrocities he was seeking to punish. He was the masterpiece created by a monster. At the defense table, Dr. Gerhardt's facade of clinical detachment finally shattered. He didn't cower. He leaned forward, his eyes burning with a terrifying manic pride. In a chilling breakdown, he began to justify his actions as the ultimate form of paternal love. He spoke of a world where children would never have to fear disease or death, claiming that he had gifted his son with a biological superiority that transcended human ethics. To Gerhardt, the screams of the sanctuary were merely the necessary white noise of progress, and his children were the chosen vessels for his godlike ambitions. He looked at Emil not as a person, but as his greatest achievement, a testament to a father who had conquered nature itself to ensure his lineage's dominance. It was a twisted, hollow confession that laid bare the predator lurking within the pioneer. Emil looked back at the man who had raised him, his gaze filled with a profound and weary pity that cut deeper than any insult. He stood tall before the court and rejected the gift of his father's science. He stated with a heartbreaking clarity that a life built on the suffering of the vulnerable and the betrayal of one's own family was a life devoid of meaning. He declared that he would rather live as a fragile mortal man with a clean conscience than as a perfected God born from shadows. This was his true redemption. He wasn't just testifying against a criminal. He was severing the invisible chains of psychological grooming that had bound him for decades. He was choosing the truth, regardless of the biological cost to himself. The judge's voice was like a hammer of iron descending upon the Koenig legacy. The verdict was swift and devastating. The Koenig medical empire was to be dismantled, its vast assets seized to provide reparations for the victims of the sanctuary. And Gerhardt was sentenced to the maximum term for his crimes against humanity. As the guards led the once towering doctor away, he looked suddenly frail, a man who had tried to play God only to be judged by the son he sought to control. Outside the courtroom, the April afternoon was bathed in golden light. Emil stood on the stone steps, ignoring the frantic questions of the international press. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the Koenig name finally begin to lift. The road ahead would be long, and his biological legacy remained an uncertain shadow. But for the first time in his life, he was free. He turned his back on the cameras in the courtroom, walking away into the softening light of the sunset. He was leaving behind a history of blood for a future of truth, a man finally stepping from his father's shadow into the light of his own humanity.